Hello, everyone, wherever you may be. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. This will be writing lecture 4, and during the course of this lecture, we'll be talking a little bit about argumentation, what is argument, how to argue, and provide a basic introduction to what logic is. So the purpose of this lecture, basic introduction on how to argue and compose a logical paragraph. So let me begin by asking you a pretty basic and simple question. If A equals B and B equals C, does A equal D? The answer is, obviously, it does not. This is illogical. And the reason why I asked this question is a paper is supposed to be constructed in the same way. You don't want an idea of A which equals B, and then an idea of a B that equals to C. You don't want your paper to conclude that A equals D. You want every single step to logically flow. Simply put, logic is that it makes sense. It has good reasoning. In the way we determine logic, there are a variety of ways in which we determine logic. For example, we have common sense. Sometimes we tend to ignore common sense and think it really does not belong in an academic paper, but common sense sometimes works. On the other hand, good evidence is also logical. And as we talked a little bit about in previous lectures, when you're composing a paragraph, you want to use good argument. You want to utilize good quotations, good facts, etc. At the same time, maybe at first glance, the argument, the logic, the quotations that you use, it's not self-explanatory. And in that case, you need to have a good argument. And that is the commentary that you will provide the reader to be able to connect something to another thing. So then, is this logical? As I asked, if A equals B, you can maybe posit that as premise number 1, and then B equals C as premise number 2, and then A equals D, the third element would be a kind of conclusion. So then how would we apply this structure and formula to a way an academic paper is written? So this is what we call a syllogism, which is an argument expressed or claimed to be expressible in the form of two propositions called the premise, right? So we have the premise 1 and the premise 2, containing a common or middle term. And in this case, the middle term, the common term would be B, right? With a third proposition called the conclusion, resulting necessarily from the other two. And by necessarily, we mean it has to happen. It's necessary. So here's an example of a syllogism. Number 1, premise number 1, all people are mortal. Premise number 2, Socrates is a person. So in this instance, what do you think is the common element, the middle term? It's person. Therefore, the conclusion would be Socrates is a mortal. We have two types of reasoning. We have what's called inductive reasoning, in which the process of inferring a general law or principle from the observation of particular instances. In other words, you're starting from the bottom. You're looking at the evidence first, you're looking at the facts first, and then having looked at all of the available evidence, drawing conclusions about them, coming up with one overall theory, one overall statement that encapsulates all the various elements that you've looked at and observed. If inductive reasoning starts from the bottom, then the opposite would obviously be deductive reasoning, in which you start from the top. where it's the process of drawing a conclusion from a principle already known or assumed. So you start from the general, inference by reasoning from generals to particulars. And particularly in academic writing, as we talked about earlier, when you start with a thesis or a hypothesis, you start with some kind of fact, some kind of statement that you want to prove. And so you're starting from the general. And you're trying to find evidence, quotations, etc., that match up with that theory or that thesis. Which isn't to say that when you are writing your papers and you are working with evidence and quotations and facts, sometimes the inductive aspect, when you're discovering facts, it might change your thesis a little bit. So it's always a constant balance between what you already have, the general, the deductive aspect, and the inductive, the particular aspect. So there's always a constant modifying and changing and dialoguing so that the evidence fits with the thesis and the thesis fits with the evidence. So going back to the syllogism we talked about earlier, if a thesis statement says something like, in this paper I will argue X by doing A, B, and C, you can almost look at the thesis as the conclusion, and then the premises, premise 1, 2, and 3 as A, B, and C from the paragraphs. And if we want to look at a paragraph, then the topic sentence could almost be considered to be the conclusion in the syllogism formula we talked about earlier. And in the concrete details, which is a bit of common knowledge, direct quote, paraphrase, they can be considered to be the individual premises. Except in this case, it's not just two premises, premise 1 and premise 2, but we also want to include a kind of premise number 3. And then we have the commentary, which explains to the reader how the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion, because, as I said earlier, sometimes it's not self-explanatory what the premises say, and the duty of the writer of the paper is to argue and convince the reader of the paper that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. And in terms of organizing an argument, you want to group similar ideas together in a paragraph, making logical units of argument. So if you're talking about pizza, for example, you don't want to all of a sudden bring in hot dogs or sushi or whatever. Make units of argument around the point you want to make, not around the sources you will use. In other words, develop an argument beforehand and then incorporate various sources and what the sources say to prove the argument that you want to make. If you write your paper based around sources, then your paper is going to be a little bit disorganized because you're jumping from one point to another. Ensure that each unit has some aspect of original thought or interpretation, and we call that the commentary. So this was a basic introduction to various types of argument. We went from syllogism to inductive and deductive reasoning, as well as a basic idea on how to organize an argument.